Good afternoon, everybody. This is Beth Osborne with Transportation for America. I'd like to welcome everyone who has joined us today to hear about our new report, the Congestion Con. There are a couple of items I want to address up front. I'm sure folks are going to be interested in whether or not the presentation and the webinar will be made available. The answer is yes. You will be able to get it through our website and our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and just type in T for America, you'll get right to our page and you should be able to find it there. If anyone has any trouble for any reason in downloading the presentation or the webinar, just let us know and we will make sure we get it to you. For those who might want to ask questions throughout the webinar, we will have a good amount of time for questions at the, after the presentations. Please enter your questions into the chat box and we will be monitoring that throughout. We will not be able to get to all the questions because we have had quite an incredible turnout, but we will answer as many as we possibly can. I want to remind everybody if you know someone who is signing in and not planning to do audio through the computer, it is only available through the computer, so they'll have trouble hearing any other way. I do want to make sure I have time to introduce our guests. If anyone does have problems with the audio, please put that in the chat box too. We will do our best to manage any technical issues. I can tell you all that with so many people using systems like this, it does seem like their systems are being stretched. So to some extent, we will just have to deal with what comes, but we'll fix what we can. I will also say that all of us presenters are presenting from our homes with our families at home too, so please be understanding of interruptions by children or other typical things, because this is a very atypical time. I'm sure many of you are facing the same thing, and I would like to say up front that I hope everyone is taking care of themselves, is healthy, is finding good ways to weather this outbreak, and I hope you and your families both health and sanity through this unprecedented situation. So from there, I'm going to introduce everyone. I'm Beth Osborne. I'm the Director of Transportation for America. Transportation for America is a national nonprofit dedicated to a transportation system that connects people to jobs and essential services by any mode of transportation, no matter their personal economics or abilities. We do this work through advocacy, through research and analysis, and through direct technical assistance to those trying to make this happen on the ground. I myself have been at Transportation for America for 5 years. Before that, I was at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where I managed the Secretary's Livability Initiative. What was then called the Tiger Program is now called the BUILD Program, and as well as major policy work like CAFE standards and safety standards, freight work, all that sort of thing. I also have with me Mariana Valdivia, who is taking the place of Salita Reynolds. Salita Reynolds, who is the director of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, was called to a city council meeting today. I'm not surprised because everyone is being taxed to respond to the COVID-19 outbreak. But Mariana has agreed to stand in Salita's place, and we are really glad she could be here. She is the supervising transportation planner with the City of Los Angeles Department of Transportation. She has over 18 years experience both in transportation planning and land use planning with the City of Los Angeles. She is currently managing the department's Vision Zero planning efforts. We also have Chuck Marohn, who is the founder and president of Strong Towns and the author of Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. He is a professional engineer licensed in the state of Minnesota and a land use planner with 2 decades of experience. He hosts the Strong Towns podcast, which I strongly recommend, and is a primary writer for the Strong Towns web content. He is presented in hundreds of cities and towns across North America and was named one of the 10 most influential urbanists of all time by Plan Edison. So thank you both, Mariana and Chuck, for participating today. And I'm just going to go through now the Congestion Con, which is the report that we recently released to the public about 10 days ago. In the Congestion Con, we utilized data that was publicly available. We wanted to track congestion and urban change over a long period of time. We could find the information we were looking for going back to 1993. I will say that the whole point of this report was to test the hypothesis that I so often hear, which is that congestion is caused by not building enough highway capacity to keep up with population growth. So we wanted to look at how that plays out based on population growth in urban areas, expansion of highways, and what has happened with congestion. The data we're utilizing is TTI's Urban Mobility Report back to 1993. We're looking at population as well at the urbanized area level, which is where TTI measures, and lane miles of freeway as reported to FHWA also in the urbanized area context. And what we found was that while population grew at a rate of 32% over that time period of 1993 to 2017, freeway capacity grew at 42% and congestion grew at 144%. I should point out that we were looking at the largest 100 metropolitan areas. I would have loved to go deeper, and maybe someday we will, but we started with the 100 largest. I will also say that not one of the largest 100 urbanized areas saw congestion go down. None saw it stay even, and the least that congestion grew was 44%. Most were 100% or higher. And digging in a little bit deeper, we looked at specific regions of the country, urbanized areas, and as you can see, what we found is those areas that expanded freeways equivalent to population growth saw more delay. Those who expanded freeways faster than population growth experienced more delay. And those who expanded freeways even with slow or no population growth saw a growth of delay. So we can find no example or no data or no trend that suggests that the amount of highway capacity you build in any way impacts reduction in congestion. We do see a lot of areas that saw actually minimal growth or negative growth, and even if they added capacity, they saw a massive increase in congestion. So we definitely find that we have failed to prove the hypothesis, and we have dug into what some of the other causes can be. I will say that it is very hard to direct to any one thing, and that is because there are several things that are impacting the growth in congestion. One is people are driving further. Every single human being is driving more than they did in 1993. And when you recognize that if everybody has to go further, of course they are going to add to the burden on the roadways. When I actually share these reports with my 8-year-old because he finds transportation interesting. I think it's that I've successfully indoctrinated him. And when I told him about what we found out, that traffic congestion is worse everywhere, he said, well, of course, people live further apart from each other, and so that means they have to drive more, and that's what causes congestion. And I thought, well, maybe this is so obvious, yet it has not seeped into our transportation planning or our land use planning. Another issue we identify is the fact that when we have roadways that are not properly connected, it means even short trips have to cover more miles. You have to take more circuitous routes. and we're dumping a lot of the traffic onto single roadways. I've often said that if you pulled some of the smartest engineers from across the world together and said, how can we create congestion with the fewest number of people, you would create the circuitous roadway system that we've created throughout, and the disconnected roadway system that we have created throughout America. That having lots of parallel routes, it spreads out the traffic and it reduces the congestion overall. We also find that where you don't cluster development, it means, if you look at the picture on the left, all of these homes, for every single thing they need to do, that is a car trip. On the right, you can, even if you're coming from an area like on the left, if you come to an area like the right, you can park your car and do a whole lot of errands in one trip. And anyone who lives close to here, that does not have to be a single car trip to every single thing, which is not even co-located in most cases. We also looked at to what extent is delay increasing people's travel time. Is it the delay, or is it the fact that people are just driving farther? And you can see from this that in a huge number of areas, these are the top 10 that have seen large increases in travel time, it is that they're driving farther. And if you're driving farther, yes, your travel time takes longer. But additionally, if you have to drive farther, and if so many people are driving farther, that also impacts delay. This is a picture that many folks in the urban community and urbanization community have seen, that, as an example of why when you spread people out, you get more congestion. In the county by Cleveland, which is Cuyahoga County, back in the 1940s, people were concentrated up by the lake, but over the intervening 50 years, people have moved throughout the county. The number of people haven't changed, they're just spread out. And that means the same number of people have to support double the infrastructure, which is a very expensive proposition, but it also means that all those people have to travel more in order to do the same things when the development was more clustered. They not only have to travel more, they have to travel farther. And when you take the same number of people and you spread them out and they have to travel more and they have to travel farther, you are going to get more congestion, and there's really no highway solution to it. We compared the way we often look at congestion between Poughkeepsie and New Orleans, and whereas the overall trips, peak travel trips, are shorter even in congestion in New Orleans, we consider New Orleans to be, quote, more congested because the proportion of their travel time attributed to delay is more. And in Poughkeepsie, even without traffic, the average trip is longer, but the portion attributed to delay is shorter. This is not a way to measure congestion that helps folks who are travelers. They want to know how long their trip is going to be, not what proportion of their trip is going to be a result of delay. So we do include several policy recommendations in our document. We talk about updating our ancient approach to land use that was developed in the 1920s by the U.S. Department of Commerce in order to deal with the problems of early 20th century America, which had to do with overcrowded urbanized areas, lack of sewer treatment and water treatment centers, and polluting industry close to people. Maybe it's time for us to revisit this to actually address 21st century problems, which might involve going back to more cluster development, focus on infill and designing for human beings. That we need to reorient our national program around access, connecting people to jobs and services, rather than measuring vehicle delay, which is something that new technology due to GIS has made quite possible, and several transportation agencies are now doing. We should require that transportation agencies stop favoring new roads over maintenance. We have a system to manage, and we can get a lot more efficiency out of it, and we could also, moving into 4, make the roadways we have much safer for people if they step out of their car. And finally, remove restrictions on pricing to allow departments of transportation to help manage demand. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to encourage people, again, to go to the chat box. We don't have any capacity to have you all speak in the call, so please make sure you introduce your questions to the chat box. And I'm going to turn things over to Mariana.
Thank you, Beth. Hello, everybody. Thank you for welcoming me into this conversation. On behalf of Celia Reynolds, the General Manager of our city's Department of Transportation, she sends her regrets. As described, she is currently meeting with the Mayor and the City Council in order to organize our city to address our emergency situation that we're in. In light of that, I understand probably like yourselves, you're juggling between work and getting into your resources to work from home. So I'm going to challenge us to actually sit and have a conversation. I don't have the benefit of slides today, but just going to challenge about how we think about city growth. In Los Angeles, our department's domain are our city streets, and along with our partner departments, including Public Works and Streets LA, we're a generally funded department, and we coordinate our efforts to focus on our city streets. Our transportation agency for the region is Los Angeles County Metro. They are a planner, coordinator, designer, and builder, and operator for our county. They serve over 9.6 million people, and that's one-third of California's residents. Caltrans, for those of you who are not familiar with our structure, is our state Department of Transportation, and they have the domain over our highways, which I, as an LA native, call freeways. A little bit about our department to give you context for our values. In the 1920s, the city adopted a code to deal with motor vehicles. And in the 30s, we became a traffic bureau within a police department. And in the 40s, we became a traffic engineering department. And in 1979, through the city ordinance, we were finally a Department of Transportation, a city department. Our vision is that all people in our city have access to safe and affordable transportation choices that treat everyone with dignity and support vibrant, inclusive communities. Freeways are not our domain, and in our region we haven't built a freeway in our area since 1993. It was part of Southern California's Freeway System Master Plan. In 1960, the 105 freeway, or the Century Freeway, was the last freeway built in our area. Some of you may be familiar with it if you've flown into LAX and tried to get on light rail. After you've jumped on a little bus shuttle, you get to our Green Line station, and that's an elevated right-of-way along the freeway. This freeway is controversial. It is known as a violator of our environmental laws. Eminent domain was practiced. 25,000 people were displaced. And even still, it has a legacy of impacting some of our county's poorest neighborhoods. So after delays and litigation, it cost $2.2 billion, making it the most expensive roadway built in the United States. I served as a planner over at LAX, and I made a quality of life choice before I accepted that position about how I could get to work. I purchased an electric vehicle and was able to use a toll lane free of charge at the time. That cut my commute to about 2/3 if I were traveling on the freeway. And I was in a privileged position to make that choice. And my goal was to get home in time after work to see my kids before they go to sleep. So these privileges afforded me access to make that trip. So when we think about the evolution of what our department values and how we make our choices, at LADOT, we focus on how people experience mobility. We partner with our engineers, and we use typical models and counts, but we're challenging ourselves to use a human lens. Think about what a person goes through and what are the choices or considerations that they make to access the resources that they need on a daily basis. Our focus is in increasing highway capacity not even for our city roadways. Instead, we're thinking about how do we use what we have? How do we improve upon the infrastructure that we have in our dense metro that affords mobility for all? Unfortunately, we're in the position to do this as a city department because it's reflective of Mayor Garcetti's Green New Deal plan. In the study, we identified that the impact of sprawl in a nutshell is that congestion is a problem that's described and can never be solved with more lanes and new roads because it's not a congestion problem. And in LA, we're not a sprawling city. We are redefining our land uses and focusing on infill strategies and thinking about increasing our housing density along our transit and rail line systems. And this is largely guided by our mobility plan, which is our land use element of our general plan. So we're focusing on improving options and access. And access, to me, is the choice that the rider goes through and thinking about those quality of life evaluations. So our North Star, our guidance, as reflected in our vision, is that anybody in our city, regardless of the neighborhood they live in or how much money they make, have a choice. Currently in our city, you can access bike share, an electric scooter, electric car share, a local rapid bus, and of course light rail and a car. And we recognize that for some folks, this is still an essential trip, a car trip. But we want to respond to empower people to make more effective trip choices. In our Vision Zero group, we're focused on the quality of our experiences, and we're putting our caps on as pedestrians, as bikers, and transit riders. And the way we're set up in our team reflects thinking about this paradigm shift in mindset to think about short trips, like identified in the report. Can we replace car trips with walking trips? Are we ensuring that our streets are safe, that people feel comfortable taking a walk to a dry cleaner, to meet up with friends after work? And these are the evaluation criteria we're focusing on. Currently in LA, we've changed and improved upon our DASH system, which is our bus circulator in neighborhoods, where folks can jump on and off readily to trip and connect to our rail system, for example. We are piloting an on-demand shared ride service that you can track on your phone. And coming off of the train, you can connect and get to your West Side destination. So these are our new ventures and what we're focusing on in the city to afford folks the opportunity to make a trip other than a car. Currently, I commute to the Civic Center, and unlike my previous car trip to the airport, I now have a variety of choices. On some days, I'm sure some of you shared that you have responsibilities after work, like baseball practice or dance practice, and that can all choose to use my vehicle. But we also in the city have the opportunity to use light rail, to jump on a bus during work. During lunchtime, I can walk to the pharmacy. And other folks are more comfortable on jumping on a scooter. I broke my ankle. I'm not. That's not really an option for me. But I think just the human lens is what we're focusing on Los Angeles. We agree that we can't build ourselves out of congestion. So I feel like considering our situation currently now more than ever, we're focusing on human experiences, and it's an opportunity to have a new appreciation for how those shared experiences are reflected in our mobility choices. Thank you.
And now I'm going to turn things over to Chuck.
Fantastic. Hey, thank you. This is Chuck Marohn with Strong Towns. I'm talking from my home in central Minnesota today. Gryffindor, the dog, and I are sitting here in the office. Happy to be able to chat with all of you I want to start just by saying thank you to Transportation for America for putting together what is really a very powerful report. It gets to this shared cultural fiction we have that somehow congestion is the problem. Congestion is the thing that is robbing us of our prosperity, is robbing us of our economic vitality, that somehow, it's congestion, and if we just battle congestion like we would fight a dragon or something like that, that somehow things will work out okay. And I love the way this report gets right at that fiction and says, look, the way we're doing this is backward. The way we're doing this is actually making the problem worse. A few years ago, I was invited by the Washington Post to come to D.C. and be part of a series they put on called America Answers. They had a lot of people far more important than me who were there speaking on issues about transportation, about congestion, about automated vehicles, and basically every facet of our transportation system today. And one of the speakers was Andrew Card. Those of you who don't know who Andrew Card is, if you remember the iconic photo back of 9/11 where the person was whispering into President George W. Bush's ear that we're under attack, the guy doing that whispering was Andrew Card. He was the president's chief of staff. But before that, he was George W. Bush's father's, George H.W. Bush, the president that the first election I voted in. It was his dad's transportation secretary. This is a guy who knows a lot about our transportation system, about the way it's funded, about what the priorities are. The thing I found remarkable about his talk, he's a Texan, and when he got up, he spoke about the difference between building transportation systems in Texas and building them, and he specifically focused on the northeast of the country. And his first of all, his premise was congestion is the problem. It's the thing we're trying to fight. It's the thing that destroys our transportation systems. The more congestion we have, the worse everything is. We need to fight congestion. That's the main problem we're trying to solve. His analysis was it's much easier to fight congestion in a state like Texas than it is in, say, the northeast of the country. Because Texas, there's a lot more land, there's a lot more space, and the land is cheaper. And so we can buy up a whole bunch of land and build additional lanes and additional capacity. And that's just an easier way. It's a cheaper way to solve the problem. If you go to the northeast of the country, land is very expensive. Land has a high cost. And so solving some of these problems becomes a lot more difficult. I was just floored. I was astounded by this because to me it's the opposite analysis. If we go to Texas, the transportation system there is so expensive because everything is so spread out. Yet it's providing such little wealth and little value creation that the land is actually really cheap. You can buy a lot of land. You can build a lot of stuff. And if you look at Texas, they have an extraordinary amount of lane miles per capita. It's astounding, and it's incredibly expensive. The state itself has repeatedly buckled under the strain of trying to maintain, let alone expand, all the transportation infrastructure they have built. If you go to the northeast of the country, yes, land is very expensive. There's another way to say that. The land is worth a lot. It's a very wealthy place. We have created a lot of wealth and a lot of value by the transportation investments we've made there. And so all of a sudden you see now a system where congestion is actually a system to actually build value within the place, create demand for alternatives such as transit, which is very, very successful in the northeast part of the country, particularly when compared to Texas. And so we look at this analysis of the former transportation secretary, former chief of staff, and he's got it 180 degrees wrong. Transportation, in a sense, it's the Yogi Berra-ism. Nobody goes there anymore because it's too busy. When we look at congestion, it is a sign of success in a sense, particularly when we get into urban areas, and particularly when you get into places that are constructed along the model of what we see in a lot of the northeastern part of the country. that expense that Andrew Card identified is actually a derivation of the wealth that's created there. I also appreciate how it was funny because I got the report from Transportation America before I went on a vacation and a staff retreat out of state. And so I looked through it, and I didn't see where I was quoted. And I was writing my notes today to talk, and then I noticed how you guys had quoted me in the report. I think the quote was the one I was going to bring up, in fact. The idea that we create the flood, we create congestion. As an engineer, it always astounded me how when we design these systems, we design them from an engineering standpoint to generate the maximum amount of congestion. That's not our intent. That's not what we set out to do. But the very nature of how we build it creates this exact thing. Yes, this is the perfect slide to describe this. And let me describe it in my terms. I love the way that it's described in the report here. Let me add a slightly different take on it, or a way to say the same thing. When we think of a stream network, it's very easy for us to picture water, coming down in rain, flowing into ditches and streams, and that flowing into small rivers, and then that flowing into larger rivers, and then major tributaries. And we're in the snow melt part of the season here in central Minnesota, and so we're starting to see towns sandbag and do things to get ahead of the seasonal flooding, because we understand that the cumulative amounts of this rain or this snow melt over a large area, when it winds up concentrated in one place, will generate a flood. Fargo, North Dakota floods every year to some degree or another, simply because of the cumulated amount of runoff. When we look at our transportation systems, they're designed to act the exact same way. You have small streets, local streets that flow into collector streets. Collector streets flow into arterials. Arterials flow into major arterials. Major arterials flow into our highway networks. When we look at this, when we aggregate those small little amounts of rain, those small little number of car trips over this broad area, and then we funnel them and channel them all through this hierarchical street network into the same spot at the same time every day, we have this shared American experience of congestion. In my little city of 13,500 people, we have a rush hour. As insane as that is, it lasts like 10 minutes. But if you went out during that 10 minutes and asked people, are we experiencing congestion, they would say, oh my gosh, this is horrible. It's unbearable. The level of congestion is terrible. We need alternate routes. We need more investment. We need more capacity. We create this flood. We have engineered and designed these systems to flood over and over again every day. I think there's an analogy here that goes along with this. So we can take this river analogy a step further, and it really points to the 5 solutions or the 5 policy approaches that Transportation for America is recommending here. What do we do in river networks when we experience flooding? What's the response we have to that? Well, we're very smart people. From an ecological standpoint, from a hydrologic standpoint, we've looked at these networks and we've realized that if we retain some of this water on site, if we keep it from running off directly into the ditch, if we keep it from running off directly into the river, if we slow down its movement, if we hold it back, what happens is it's allowed to seep in place, and we don't generate that runoff. We don't generate that capacity, and so you don't get the cumulative impact of all these small little amounts of runoff. You don't get the flood. That's the only way to handle a hydrologic event, is to retain the water in place. We'll switch back to your road network now. The only way for us to deal with congestion is not to build a wider river at the end. It's not to build, a bigger berm or more capacity. The only way to really effectively deal with congestion is to keep those trips from happening in the first place, to provide people with alternatives, to create neighborhoods where people can walk, where people can decide to drive at different times. I think there's a ton of opportunity here for us to build fantastic places at a much, much lower cost if we can get past this shared fiction that somehow congestion is the problem. and start looking at it instead as the catalyst for a new approach and a new set of public policy responses.
Great. Thank you, Chuck. So at this point, we are going to move into questions, and I'm just going to dive into some of the questions that have come in. We've already received so many great ones, and we'll get to just as many as we possibly can. The first one is actually a combination of a couple questions, and one that continues to bother me, which is a lot of these findings, I'm talking about my own report, are not new. I remember reading The Power Broker in college, which was written back in 1972, that talked about induced demand. It talked about urban form, and we've seen repeated attempts to point out that just building more highways does not fix the problem. Michael Skelly said that this is, in his question, this is a complex explanation. Any tips on how to make this clear to the public and politicians who might have short attention spans? And then Dane Forlines also said the same thing. The general population and special interest groups often still demand highway expansions. How can we change this paradigm? I'll just start by saying this report is an attempt to make it simple and make it visual and make it clear. And instead of saying what you're doing won't work in theory, we're just showing it's worked really, really badly, because not one of these largest 100 cities have seen even congestion stay even, much less go down. The smallest increase was 44%, which was the Detroit area. Everybody else is significantly higher. This includes areas losing population. So I'm hoping that argument that even areas losing population and adding capacity are seeing congestion increase. So how is that possible? Maybe we need to look a little bit closer. But I'd love to hear from Chuck. What do you think? What's the way to communicate this that people will finally listen? And same thing, from Mariana, just let me know if you all have ideas on what has worked in communicating with people.
This is Chuck. I'll try to attack this one first. I do think that there is a powerful fiction that this report peels back. Like I said, the idea that congestion is the problem and that somehow building capacity will fix it. And I think that's a really, really helpful way to get us past this kind of, I almost want to use some addiction language. It's almost part of a 12-step program in a sense. Like we acknowledge that this belief we have is not true. I think there's a parallel thing, though, that we are going to be faced with here very shortly. A lot of the investments we make in infrastructure and a lot of the investments we make, particularly in transportation, are really about inducing growth. They are really about how do we, at the kind of centralized level of our economy, push a lever, essentially inject capital into the system and have that result in increased GDP and lower unemployment. If we go back to the post-war era in the 1950s and 1960s, transportation construction was an easy way to do this. You have a population coming out of the Depression, coming out of war, and this was a very logical public policy step for them to take at that time. As you know, Beth, we have long passed the diminishing returns on this system. But the inertia of the programs have just kind of kept going and going and going. I think what we see right now with the economic situation we are entering into, there's been this tension for a number of years now, and I think you can see it before the pandemic issue became front and center. You can see it in our politics and in the way we talked about this, the income inequality and all the different quality of life things and just the fragility of families and small businesses, et cetera. I think now that we're seeing this demand destruction across a broader spectrum, we're actually going to have an opportunity, I think, to rethink what it means to make good investments in our economy, what real strength looks like in a place, and how we can leverage the capital and the capacity and the resources we have to build stuff that doesn't just give us GDP and economic growth next quarter, but actually makes our places stronger, more resilient, better places to live, more adaptable, able to handle different situations, foreseen and unforeseen. I think that your report comes at the perfect time to help us rethink a whole set of structures that maybe served us well 60 years ago, maybe, but certainly have long passed their useful life and need to be set aside for other policy approaches.
Thanks, Chuck. Mariana, do you want to add to that and just talk about how this is applying to your conversation in LA?
From a practical implementation point of view, the words that you described that resonate with me in terms of a simple and visual approach really resonate with our team. We're really focusing on ground-rooted outreach, really practical input from our communities, folks who are transit dependent, who need mobility and off hours, low wage earners, non-English speaking residents, are storytellers about what's happening in the communities, the level of livability, and the challenges that they face on a day-to-day basis. And understanding those challenges, our role is to translate, if you will, in our recommended designs or contemplating how community resources are accessed, influence our approach and recommendations to decision makers. It's really honing in on these are the best practices, evidence-based designs that meet our city standards, but address community needs and concerns. Recently, for example, on our team, which is inclusive of engineers and planners, we were thinking about where do we place a crosswalk, for example. And we contemplated our standards, the technical requirements for the implementation of the signal, and we took a breath and we paused and we thought, where do people need to go? The market is this many feet away. Isn't it a better decision to contemplate a safe crossing for where the market's at? And having that upfront, really practical, grounded conversation among and between users and our elected officials have allowed us to move forward in implementing practical steps for people's level of comfort to really implement other strategies for mobility that are not cars or building capacity, highway capacity, I should say.
Excellent, thank you. We got a very interesting and I think important question about VMT and how it is related to mobility. The question comes from Thomas Hastings, who says, doesn't the increase in VMT also indicate a rise in mobility? While I agree that we can't build ourselves out of congestion, I think we should recognize increasing capacity does have a benefit, although, of course, it leads to suboptimal land use patterns such as increased sprawl, in that more people can drive to more places in about the same amount of time. I think this is a question that occurs to a lot of people, and why it's important we bring this into the conversation. I would say one of the biggest problems we have is historically we haven't had a really good way to measure access to the things that we need. And if VMT is a sign that people are accessing more places, then maybe it is a good thing. But if VMT is going up because the things you need are further away from you, that is not a sign of greater mobility. It's actually a sign of lower access to essentials. It means you have to travel farther to do the same things that you used to do in your own neighborhood. And that's one of the reasons why Transportation for America is working with the State Smart Transportation Institute out of the University of Wisconsin to help transportation agencies quantify how many jobs and services people have access to by car by bike, by transit, by their own 2 feet, as a measure of the transportation system. Historically, we've just looked at how much people drive. And if people are driving in circles, that, if we use VMT as the sign of mobility, then driving in circles shows great mobility. But it doesn't actually help you accomplish anything, and that's why I moved to access using the GIS-based systems we have that show us where the houses are and where the jobs are and where the groceries are and where the banks are, and looks at how long it takes to drive there, what are the routes, how long it takes to take transit there, whether it's walkable or bikeable. This would get us into a conversation about whether or not people are able to do more things within the same period of time, or if they're just traveling more to do the same thing. Mariana and Chuck, what do you have to say about that?
This is Chuck. I can take a stab at that. First, I did a event with Rando O'Toole. It was actually billed as a debate a few years back. For those of you that don't know Rando O'Toole, he is a libertarian. He talks in these same circles, but from a libertarian perspective. And he made this argument about mobility. He said, the more mobile we are, the more places we can reach, and the better off our standard of living will be, and our quality of life and our economy. And he used the example of, now you can reach a big box grocery store that will have 40 different types of mustard, where, back before we had this mobility, your local grocer would maybe only have 1 type of mustard or 2 types of mustard. And I remember thinking about that and just pondering the idea of quality of life being measured in, the number of choices that you have in that dimension. Because there are other dimensions to look at choice as well. The neighborhood that I live in today is the first neighborhood built in Brainerd, Minnesota. So the original plat included the downtown and then this residential neighborhood just adjacent. In looking at the old records and speaking to people who were here, in my parents' age, which, my parents are mid-60s, so we're not talking about ancient times by any means, there were over a dozen different corner grocers or food providers, essentially. There was bakeries and butchers, and there was a Finnish grocer, and there was a Norwegian grocer. So I guess there's a huge distinction between those different food types back then. You look at this, and yeah, there were not 40 different types of mustard, but culturally there were all kinds of different things that not only were available, but were available by, I could drive to them if I wanted to. I could also walk to them. I could also take, back in those days, we had a trolley car that ran through the neighborhood. I could have taken that to get to any of these places. In my own neighborhood, there were over a dozen. In the other neighborhoods in town, again, there were dozens in those neighborhoods as well. And so now we've reduced all that to one big box store, which, oh, by the way, has no toilet paper on the shelf, has no meat, and as soon as we reach the point of people rushing into the store because they can't get stuff, we find that everything we get has also been optimized for efficiency and is produced in China or South America or someplace where the supply chain goes through many, many hands and is very fragile in times like these. So I think that if we want to measure mobility and equate that to prosperity, I think it's got to be a multidimensional analysis. It can't just be one essentially framed in the big box mindset.
So I also have a bunch of questions about, what are the levers for making some of these changes. I thought I might address federal, and maybe, Mariana, you could talk about local. So one of the big levers we have is the reauthorization of the National Transportation Program. We're currently operating under a general paradigm that has existed in close to this form since 1982, just yesterday. The current version of it is called the FAST Act. That was passed about 5 years ago and expires at the end of this fiscal year. There have been proposals to reauthorize it in the Senate. there's a version that has only been passed by one of the 4 committees that have to act, and it's unlikely to move forward. The House is still writing their version, and I think there's an anticipation they'll be taken up next year at this time. So talking with your federal representatives about this report and how the program could be updated to reflect what we have learned over the last half century would be a good thing. But there's a lot that needs to be done on the land use side, because if you require that businesses are put behind a fourth a mile of parking, that's not going to be a very walkable setting. If they require wide roads, if they require low density and they force people further and further out, there's only so much that transportation can be done. Mariana, why don't you talk about what people can do in communications with their local officials about how to address congestion in maybe a more modern way?
I think regularly we interact with elected official staff. They are partners in doing town halls, workshops, and the opportunity to interact with the constituency and observe their stories about access and the challenges they face to get places is the leverage that, as planners, as engineers, we have to present design options, to present strategies that impact this quality of life dynamic, the community feeling and pride that we have for movement that's welcoming to the needs of all types of folks who have day-to-day movement needs. In terms of land use and our guidance for Los Angeles and the mobility element, our partners in the Department of City Planning have taken a step back and identified that based on the space that we have, our growing population, our zoning regulations did not forward our needs for spaces, for housing units. Unlike, the development a decade ago, we see high rises, we see growth happening in downtown, an area that previously people, natives, kept away from. It was unsafe. It was thought it wasn't considered a destination. Now we've got folks who in Los Angeles actually work and live and have entertainment opportunities, a train right away. And our zoning code reflects those incentives, and we're able to provide those opportunities to our citizens. So I think there's a partnership for developmental incentives with our land use regulators, having conditions of approval that reflect best practices in alleviating parking, like you described, even pedestrian enhancements for bus stops that'll serve developments are real strategies that we're considering in our development process in our city.
Thank you. I'm just already feeling so badly about all of the amazing questions we are never going to get to. I did get one question about, who are the folks that we see at the agency level doing really good work on these issues? And I would say the reason we have LA on this is because we're really excited about some of the things that they're taking on. I've worked a lot with the state of Virginia, which has really brought in this notion of access to jobs, with a breakout of access to jobs for lower income populations, but also access to other important destinations like banks and groceries and schools and medical care. And I think that they've really provided a model that other DOTs could use. I'd love to hear examples from Chuck about others that you find to be doing really exciting things. I mean, I think the good news is there's a whole bunch of agencies that are tackling this and trying to do things differently. And if we could bring the federal program in line with a more modern point of view, it would help more agencies take a more modern approach. Chuck, do you have any thoughts about which agencies are starting to recognize some of the issues raised by the report and doing better?
That's an interesting question, and I actually feel like I'm maybe not the right person to answer it, simply because my focus is more on the city level and what local leaders are doing. I'm very convinced that the leadership right now today that our country needs the most is going to come from mayors, city councils, city administrators, local leaders. And I think the agency response needs to really be to turn around and serve them, as opposed to, the programs that, in a sense, how do we accomplish the objectives of the agencies? How do we turn around and say to those local leaders, hey, where are your people struggling? Like, what are the things you need? I've seen some degree of flexibility. I mean, obviously, you mentioned the Tiger program earlier and its new iteration, and I've been critical of it in the past to a degree about some of the impacts. But I also, I think will agree with the spirit of it, which was designed to give a lot more flexibility for people to do things differently at the local level. I think the more we can inject that in, the better off we'll be. But there's some cities doing amazing stuff. I mean, Memphis, Detroit, Shreveport. To me, these are places that I've watched change their approach from one of how do we build as much more as we can to how do we make a lot more productive use of what we already have. And I'm inspired by that.
I think that's a really great point, Chuck. And quite frankly, there's really no transportation agency that can do a great job if they don't have great local partnerships. We focus a lot on the freeways here, but the fact of the matter is that we're talking about the way local arterials are designed and local roads, many of which are designed with some of the same standards we use for those highways, and that's unacceptable. Several of our questioners asked the question of how we convince localities to move away from measures like level of service, how can we use impact fees, and all kinds of other local tools that are available. And I wish we had another hour to talk through all of those because I think every single one of them has a role to play. I'd also say that it really is going to take the locals getting a land use under control to if we're serious about addressing congestion and access to the things we need. But I also invite all of the folks who have tuned in today, if you all have examples of folks doing great things, please send them our way. We'd like to know about them. We'd like to follow them. We'd like to share them with our networks because we shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel in every metropolitan area. Again, I apologize for not getting to all the questions. There are so many good ones, and I'd love to have individual conversations with each and every one of you. If there are folks that you want to make sure see this report and we can be helpful in getting it to them, we would really like to partner with you on that. For those of you trying to make this case at the local level, I think really one of the best things you can do is if your local level is one of those listed in this report, show them the results of their current efforts and ask them, does it make sense to keep doing what we're doing? Because if they do, they're going to get more of the result that's listed in the report, and no area has a good story to tell. You might also look at going a little bit deeper for your own area now that you know where we found some of the statistics if you live in a smaller area, which many of which are seeing the same trend. In the meantime, again, thanks for tuning in today. Thanks for your excellent questions. Mariana and Chuck, thank you so much for participating. And remember that you can find the report. You'll be able to find the webinar on our webpage, which is www.tforamerica.org. Thanks, everybody.